Very much. So my name's Zosia Beckles. I'm a Research Information Analyst at the University of Bristol. I'm actually standing in for my colleague Kirsty Merritt, who unfortunately is unwell and couldn't be here today. Please do forgive me if this isn't quite as smooth in practice as it might otherwise be. It was slightly short notice. I have been with the Research Data Service for 10 years, so I'm pretty sure that I know this material quite well. The title here is a nod to the kind of maritime history of Bristol, and also the fact that we think we're getting our sensitive data processes into in kind of shipshape. I think it's an ongoing battle, but yeah, slowly but surely, I think we're getting there. So. Now, famous last words. Can you still see my slides?
I can, but it's still the opening slide.
Okay.
There you go.
Brilliant. I can't, for some reason, my setup is not letting me see both you guys and the slides. So we'll just go with the slides and let me know if anything disappears at any point. Okay, so the outline for what I'm going to talk about today. Firstly, some background and definition so that we're all on the same page with regards to the history of the Research Data Service at Bristol and what I'm talking about when I talk about sensitive data. And then the meat of the presentation is going to be these 7 lessons that we've learned throughout the 10-year history of sharing sensitive data. And then if I've timed everything right, we'll wrap up in time with about 10 minutes for Q&A. Okay, so in terms of background, our service, the Research Data Repository, data.bris, and the Research Data Service that supports it, launched in 2011. Initially, this was just open data and just for the arts faculty, but the demand was such that we quickly expanded that to cover the whole university. We published our first dataset in 2012, and since 2015, we've been core funded as a part of the library. And this was also in the year when we realised the demand for sensitive data publication options, and so constituted a task and finish group, which used the expert advisory group on data access, EAGDA, report recommendations as the foundation for developing our controlled release process for sensitive data. And in that same year, we published our first dataset with access restrictions. In 2019, I developed the Disclosure Risk Assessment Service. So this is kind of an add-on, an extra pair of eyes, a way to reassure researchers, the institution, and research participants that we are taking this kind of potential disclosure risk seriously, and we're making that process of data release as safe as we possibly can. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. In 2025, so as of today, we have 174 data sets with access restrictions, so 107 restricted and 67 controlled. About 1,200 open and about 150 metadata stubs that are records pointing out to external data sets. And in terms of our access levels, so as I kind of alluded to, we've got 3. So we've got open data available to anyone. And then in terms of restrictions, we have restricted access and controlled. Restricted access data is data where there's just a metadata page, and applicants have to apply and provide the reason why they want access, evidence of institutional affiliation, evidence that their institution has appropriate information security policies, ethical approval if required. We would also need an institutional signatory from them so that the contract to release the data access agreement, is signed and agreed between institutions, not person to person. And provided all of those criteria are met, then the decision to release data or not is made by our team, by the Research Data Service, once we've got a signed data access agreement. For controlled data, it's basically exactly the same process, but the actual decision to release data is taken by our data access committee. And I'll talk a bit more later on about how that's constituted. But essentially, it means that there's more oversight. So that is a controlled access is for higher risk data sets, or data sets with greater sensitivity in some way. Okay, so that is the kind of history of our service. So I'll spend a little bit of time now talking about kind of the definitions of sensitivity that we use in our repository. So the task and finish group, which set up the process for controlled data release, I said it was based on the EAGDA report principles, and they came up with some kind of potential definitions for why data might be sensitive. So, you know, it has commercial or other kind of contractual constraints on it. The data is perhaps subject to export control, or it kind of it's politically sensitive for some reason. And we do sort of, and on the right, you'll see a screenshot from our public facing information for researchers page. And so you can see that we do try and bring out some of that that nuance and that context in that description. But by far and away, the largest category of sensitive data is data that contains human information on human participants, which can't be sufficiently anonymized, or for which there's no kind of ethical clearance for sharing. And that latter, the lack of ethical clearance, it will form the basis of one of the other lessons later on. That's what we call legacy data, basically. But yeah, so that's kind of that forms the bulk of our sensitive data, and that's kind of what the rest of the talk is going to focus on. So, lessons learned. First thing to note is kind of the big one is around consent, and also making sure that you have buy-in and a good rapport with research ethics committees. So we found it was really, really valuable to make contact with chairs of ethics committees, with the research governance team, and to get them thinking really early on about the fact that data sharing needs to be mentioned in ethics documents, so consent forms, information sheets, and to get them thinking about what that means for ethical approval processes, and how to kind of incorporate that that point of view into their decision making. We found it was really useful to provide case studies to the rec chairs to sort of show the impact of getting things wrong at the consent form stage, and how that can affect the researchers' ability to publish papers and, you know, the institutions as a whole. So that was a really good driver in terms of making sure that rec chairs and committees as a whole were kind of paying attention to this issue. One of the things we tried to do was to meet them where they're at, and to reassure them that we weren't trying to kind of encroach on their territory. We weren't trying to pretend to be experts in research ethics generally. It's just, you know, we have some expertise in this very specific area of data sharing, and that's what we were trying to support them with, basically, to get them focused on this particular aspect. Because yeah, you know, they're incredibly busy people, and making sure that, you know, you kind of pitch the message in the right way was really a really important part of getting buy-in. Template. This is something that we have absolutely not cracked yet. The way that things work at Bristol, we don't really have centralized templates for consent forms and information sheets. Schools, faculties, departments may have their own that kind of handed down from researcher to researcher as family heirlooms, and therefore it's really difficult to get hold of a master copy and update it and be sure that that will then trickle out to everyone else. So yeah, I'm in the process of working with research governance actually to develop some template clauses just for data sharing that we can make available, you know, on an intranet or something like that for researchers to copy and paste. But in general, our research governance team tries to steer away from that sort of copy and paste approach, because they want the researchers to really think about what they're putting in the consent forms, which is, you know, completely reasonable. But yeah, it does mean that researchers who do rely on pro forma documents are using ones that don't have the right and up-to-date wording. So yeah, that is a problem. One thing that we have had some success with is getting the research governance team to amend the ethics approval process to include a flag to researchers to get them to contact us, our team, the Research Data Service, and get their consent forms and information sheets checked for alignment with data sharing plans. And having that done at an early stage means, as I say, that you can head problems off at the pass and get things right early on and avoid a lot of the problems down the line. Sorry, bear with me one moment. So a little bit more detail on the consent form aspects. So the reason that we wanted to focus on consent forms is that we were getting, we're seeing a lot of consent forms that looked like this, for example. So these are two clauses from the same consent form. At the top, you can see, I understand that my data will be kept confidential and that only the research team will be able to access information about me. And the second, I understand that the data may be used by other researchers after the project ends. And these are in the same consent form. And so, there's no qualifiers there. So will participants really understand that those two uses of data are referring to different kinds of data? So the top one is probably referring to the sort of personal identifiable information that, names, contact details that you might use for administrative purposes. And the second is referring to probably anonymized research data, but it's not clear. And certainly if our team got a dataset publication request with a consent form like that, we would definitely not be comfortable making it available, definitely not openly, possibly with some access restrictions, but it would involve a lot of work to go back to the ethics committee, maybe go back to the sponsor, possibly even reconsent the participants. But yeah, you'd have to jump through a lot of hoops to be able to publish a dataset with this sort of really ambiguous consent. So yeah, just kind of to stress that it's that data is not really meaningful unless there's some kind of qualifier to explain to the research participants what kind of data, what are you referring to, ideally with concrete examples, but yeah, some sort of qualifier to explain what's going on there. So some of the solutions that we found to be quite effective. So in our kind of training and guidance, being clear that researchers should ideally separate in their consent form wording in their information sheets what's going to happen to research data versus what's going to happen to the sort of personal information that's needed for administrative purposes, because researchers are likely to do very different things with those two classes of information, and so that needs to be made clear in communications to the participants. Also, being clear on what's going to happen to both types of data after the study ends, how long they're going to be kept for, and who's going to have access to them. And thirdly, being clear on what's going to happen to a participant's data if they withdraw. So, a participant could withdraw participation in the study, but that doesn't mean that their data will be withdrawn as well. The researcher might want to keep processing it, and there might become a point after which that data can't be withdrawn at all. So anonymization has already taken place, for example. And so, yeah, just being clear to the participant that what's going on and what their choices are with regard to withdrawal. And one of the reasons that the guidance that we've developed with our secretary's office, with our data protection office, is that ideally researchers should rely on the public task legal basis for processing data under GDPR. And one of the reasons for that was to try and get away from this confusion between ethical consent to participate in a study and consent for data processing under GDPR, because obviously you can withdraw both or neither, or withdraw one and not the other. And it kind of removes one source of potential confusion with regard to data management. And so, yeah, we kind of advise researchers to use public task as the basis for processing data, and so therefore the only way that they're referring to consent in the consent forms is in the context of ethical consent to participate in a study. And lastly, the sort of, again, with regards to wording, the word archive means different things in different contexts in different disciplines, and so some people will see archive and think that refers to sharing. Some will see archive as just long-term preservation, regardless of whether or not that also includes making it available to other people. So for clarity, one of the things that we advise our researchers is to use words like store, which kind of captures that storage during the lifetime of the project, beyond it, the long-term preservation, and then sharing to discuss what the plans are for making the data more widely available. So it kind of clarifies that both those aspects, which can be captured in the one-word archive, but aren't necessarily. Right, so following on from consent forms, we also, as I said, review information sheets, and a couple of things that we found really useful to look for are, firstly, making sure the researchers are being clear what they're doing with regards to collecting data. So is data going to be encrypted? What devices is it going to be stored on? Are they using any kind of cloud storage? And following on from that, where are they storing data in the short term, whilst the project is in the active analysis phase, and then at the end of the project as well. Critically, who's going to have access to those data stores, both during the research and beyond. As I mentioned before, being clear on the last point that participants can withdraw their data. And if they can, being specific about the degree of anonymity that participants can expect. This can be really difficult because, as I'm sure you can imagine, as re-identification techniques become more and more sophisticated, it's very difficult to anticipate what the risk will be in 5, 10, 20 years. But if researchers can give some information about the approach they're taking to anonymization, removal of direct identifiers, using some kind of access restrictions and things like that to restrict the potential reuses and that sort of thing, whether or not participant data can or will be linked to other data sets, that sort of information should ideally be included in an information sheet as well, so that participants can make a truly informed decision about what they're going to do and what's going to happen to their data. We also look for check that researchers are being clear about what data they're going to share, because obviously they might collect and keep privately more than they share with others, and include information on what platform they're going to use for sharing and what the restrictions will be. And also clarity on whether they are going to keep any personal information for, for example, contacting participants for follow-up projects, or using data for future projects, whether or not it's been shared externally as well. And then finally, deletion. So our repository operates on a sort of once published, it's available in perpetuity model, but that might not be the case for as far as funder requirements or things like that. So it is important that the researchers are kind of clear with participants as to what's happening in that respect as well. So lesson 2. The rest, the remaining lessons get much shorter, so don't worry. I think we will finish on time. So yeah, the second thing that we learned was that what researchers want, what they really want, is a DOI. They're at the point of publication. They don't kind of have time to think about the nuances of data curation and so on. They're just interested in that DOI. So if you throw up barriers at that point, it's really important to kind of explain really clearly why that's happening, what the reason is, because if they realize that it's because of a problem with the consent form, then the next time they'll get it right. And the other thing is to make sure that they understand that just because data isn't open doesn't mean it isn't fair. And also, and the fact that fair data is kind of the principle that underpins our university data policy, most funder data policies, and most publisher data policies as well. So this kind of concept of as open as possible, as closed as necessary, really getting them on board with that, and helping them, if necessary, to push back on publishers who sometimes don't seem to have read their own data policies and are pushing for data to be made open when that's just completely inappropriate. So yeah, kind of this is also a good opportunity to kind of do that advocacy and engagement with regards to fair data. But yeah, as I kind of alluded to at the top of the slide, one of the things we learned very quickly was don't issue DOIs until you've actually got the data, because, you know, understandably, what researchers want is that DOI to put in their manuscript to be able to submit, and then, yeah, you know, other things become more of a priority after that, and so we are then left with a DOI that doesn't resolve because the data set was never finalized. So yeah, so one of the kind of key things we learned was, yeah, make sure you have the data before you give them the DOI. But yeah, generally when researchers know better, they do better. So it's a kind of a learning process. And as I said, if somebody trips up with consent form wording once, by the time they come to publish a second data set with us, they've usually fixed those problems, fixed their consent forms, and it's a much smoother process. So yeah, it's kind of an incremental process, but it definitely works. So third sort of trick that I thought would be useful to share is around pre-publication checking. So we actually have a quite light touch approach to requirements for data sets. I'm aware that a lot of repositories will have much sort of stricter rules. We've got some requirements around having a README and some sort of bare bones information on what needs to go in it. Apart from that, the main thing that we require is a consent form and information sheet. And just making sure that we are consistent in whatever rules we do apply. One of the main things we do in the pre-publication checking is to make sure that the permissions in the consent form match up with the information sheet, match up with the dataset, match up with the access level, because, you know, all of that has to be consistent in order to be published. And it's been really useful to kind of build up a bank of problems and solutions so that we can be sure that we are consistently applying those rules and solutions to problems as they arise and arise again. That said, it's definitely going to be the case that, you know, practice moves on, and a decision that we made right at the inception of the sensitive data publication process is not going to be the same decision that we'd make today. But again, you know, making sure that we have that documentation process, and that we are, you know, recording why we're making, what decision we're making and why, which will enable us to kind of understand why things have changed, and making sure that we're following the current best practice going forward. So yeah, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, thinking about legacy data. So this is collections of data that have been gathered before data sharing was kind of really on the radar. So the consent forms and information sheets are either missing entirely, or they don't mention data sharing at all or in not enough detail. So one of the common things that we get is people trying to kind of sidestep the data publication process by, you know, just taking a copy of the deposit agreement, the data access agreement, and using that as a kind of peer-to-peer contract. And well, we can't stop them from taking the paperwork, but we don't do the administrative part of kind of supporting that process. If they want to use our structures and they want to use our labor, our time, then they have to use the deposit process. And that means that you basically get a improves transparency of data sharing. And we have kind of a seal of approval. You know, we've got a approval from the University Research Committee to push this to make it clear that we want to share our research data with everyone who's eligible, not just with, you know, individual peer-to-peer sharing, which is, yeah, not really transparent and not equitable either. One of the things that we often find is that we'll be contacted by researchers who have had a request from someone else to access their data, but they haven't actually published it yet. You know, again, really common with legacy data sets. You know, it's been sitting in on a departmental drive for 15 years, and somebody actually wants it now, and the researcher's sort of coming to us with this person wants it, how do I give it to them? And so one of the things we have learned is that we can use a parallel process whereby we start the request process. So, you know, start getting that information on the requester, the information security policies, ethical approval, that kind of stuff. as well as starting the data ingest process for the data owner. And that means that we can kind of do things a bit more smoothly and a bit more quickly by having those processes run in parallel. Lesson 5 is around the disclosure risk service. So this is my baby. This is the service that I set up in 2019. Basically, I'm there as a kind of a backstop, a second pair of eyes to check that when researchers say the data is anonymized, it actually is. Because yeah, especially if you're doing things like publishing interview transcripts, it's really, really easy to miss things. So yeah, just having a second pair of eyes to look over that kind of stuff can be really useful. And one of the sort of key things I do is also consider the wider data environment. So thinking about what other information is out there that could potentially change the risk inherent in the data itself. So for example, thinking about, if maybe there's no information on geographical location in the data set, but there's a protocol out there that says people were recruited from these 3 areas in Bristol. And then obviously that changes the likelihood that individuals could be re-identified by the variables that are in the data set. So that kind of thing. But basically, it's kind of it's an iterative process of sort of balancing the sensitivity of the data set against the utility, because obviously the more you take out of it, the more you anonymize it, the less useful it is. And so yeah, kind of having that conversation with the researcher about, well, these are things you could do, this is the effect it could have, these are some of the other approaches we could take in terms of, rather than anonymization approaches that change the data itself, using a kind of functional anonymization approach by controlling the data environment, applying access restrictions to it. So yeah, those sorts of conversations. At the moment, well, when I started, the idea was that I would have sort of half my time on sensitive data training, advocacy and disclosure risk work, and half my time on research metrics, responsible metrics training. In reality, it's much closer to 0.8 FTE on sensitive data and 0.2 on the other stuff, and possibly even higher to 0.9. But yeah, as you can imagine, there's the sort of the demand on the service and also the kind of risks for that part of the work they kind of outweigh the responsible metrics side, which is a bit of a shame, but such is life. And this service, the research data service as a whole, and this particular disclosure risk assessment service can be named in data management plans to sort of flag to funding bodies that this is something that researchers have support for institutionally, and can really help to make a funding bid more attractive. But I will say, before I had this specific role, I was doing the same kind of work that Kirsty is now, sort of a research support librarian in this team. And we didn't have a sensitive data specialist. So what we did was kind of make sure that we had good contacts and good conversations with the network of data scientists and statisticians across the university, because there is the expertise in risk analysis. It's just that they don't necessarily have the time to dedicate to doing it for every data publication that might need it. But going to them and making sure that we were having the conversations and getting their input if there was something we weren't sure about. It helped to inform the fact that we did need somebody on staff to do this stuff, but also meant that we were making use of the expertise that already existed, and yeah, kind of building up that network of contacts. So yeah, I would say that was one of the really, really key things that helped drive the demand for this service and keep it, and keep our work at a high level even before we had dedicated staff time for it. Lesson 6. So this is really about making sure that you have institutional buy-in and institutionally approved processes. So our task and finish group kind of converted into the current data access group, and it's got membership comprised of people from research governance, secretary's office, IT services, contracts, academics, and our team. So we kind of got a wide range of people with expertise from all kinds of different areas. And the idea is that they each bring their own perspective. So it's not that we're expecting somebody from research governance to be able to interrogate the information security policies of a different institution. They just look at the ethics applications and that sort of thing. So everyone's bringing their own individual perspective, and collectively we're able to assess risk and make a decision. One of the key things in terms of making the process run smoothly was around defining the terms, what we were talking about. So making sure that we had clear definitions for what was an appropriate institutional signatory, what was appropriate documentation to show ethical approval, and that kind of thing. And inevitably, it wasn't a linear process, and we had to be prepared to go back and have the conversations again when we had new information, and so on and so forth. And it's still an ongoing piece of work today. But yeah, one of the key things was making sure that we could present solutions along with problems to sort of minimize the amount of discussion and tangents that happened in committee. So yeah, just one more slide before I break for questions. The Columbo classic, just one more thing. There's always going to be something else. We're still learning, still adapting, still growing. One of the key areas where we come up with problems is with the contract. So particularly with data access agreements between Bristol and recipients overseas, making sure that the terms of the agreement map over to the data protection governance regime in that location, and things like that can be quite tricky. And as much as we might try to sort of have one standard contract, and if you don't like it, then you don't get the data, in reality, it's just not the case. There's often a lot of back and forth. The other thing is third-party data owners. So this is something we ran into with NHS data, where we would get their permission to publish, but realized that actually when we looked into it in more detail, it didn't actually include any information on timeline, so like how long we could hold the data for, or it maybe didn't actually specify that we could share that data onwards. And so yeah, getting that kind of clarity in anytime you've got to go back to say NHS sponsors and ethics committees for permission to do things, like getting all that detail down the first time is really helpful. Yeah, and the kind of host of other sorts of issues we've come across. Yeah, finding equivalencies between NHS and ethics structures overseas. The fact that a lot of non-UK institutions don't actually require ethics approval for secondary use of data, which is quite different to the UK context and has thrown up some problems, because obviously if their systems don't allow them to apply for ethics approval, then we can't really request it from them. So yeah, sort of finding ways to marry that with our requirements has been quite interesting. And lastly, just to kind of record keeping again, over 10 years, there's been a lot of change in the Data Access Committee. So, being clear on what decisions were made and why is really useful to be able to ensure that, a Data Access Committee in 5-10 years time is going to come to the same conclusions and make the same decision about a similar request for the same data set. So I will stop there. I have run over a little bit, apologies, but I think there should still be 5 minutes left for questions. So yes, if anyone has any questions, please speak now.